Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Slow Living Summit Finance and Farming panel. This is the fourth day of our first ever virtual Slow Living Summit conference. I'm just going to wait a few minutes and let some folks join before we start our program. All right. I think we'll start. So my name is Lissa Harris. I'm the Executive Director of Strolling of the Heifers. I just want to welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to be talking about financing farming, which is a topic that I know lots of folks are interested in and a pretty broad topic. So we have a really great group of people who have joined us today. And I'm going to introduce, as I always do, my colleague Jen Brandt, who is the coordinator of Slow Living Summit. She'll tell you a little bit more about what to expect today.
Hello, everybody. Thanks again for joining us on our fourth day. This has been very exciting, so many really amazing topics, and we have so many more to come as well. Today, we have a really great diverse panel. We have a social ecologist, we have a lawyer, we have two regenerative farmers, and I'm gonna let them introduce themselves, but that's just sort of the layout of what we have in store today. We are talking about a little bit about regenerative farming, a little bit about structuring of financing, and just kind of having a conversation around those topics. I'm also going to launch a poll right now to kind of see who's on the call. And we open up the chat right now, the Q&A rather, to sort of, if folks want to get specific things out of this talk, we are welcome to ask us any specific questions, and then we can go from there, and they can kind of sort of form the talk around what people are interested in. So I'll go ahead and launch this poll right now. I hope folks can see that. If you having trouble, you can put a comment in the Q&A. We had a few more people join as well. So for those who just joined, if you didn't hear me, we did just launch a poll to see who is on the call today. So if you can just put your answer in the poll, and if you have any specific things you'd like to get out of the talk, you can put that in the Q&A. Okay. So.
Also, if you chose other, tell us what the other is in the Q&A.
Yes, I totally forgot that part. Okay. 78% voted. That might just be us. The rest of us have it. So if I end the poll, Lisa, that should show us answers. Okay. So I'm gonna end the poll right now. If people join late, you can always answer in the Q&A. Okay. All right. Can everyone on the panel see that?
Yeah, I think you have to share it.
Oh, share it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So now all the attendees should be able to see, and the panelists should be able to see. Who's in the room?
For those who said other, if you could put that in the Q&A, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Right, a good mix. Got a good mix of folks.
Okay, cool. I think that's, oh, okay.
Oh, you want me to put it back up?
I think that's fine.
I'll put it back up for a few more seconds.
Oh.
There it is again. All right.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and let you kick it off. I think Julie's going to start off, and I will take my screen off.
Right. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julie Snorek, and I'm a social ecologist. I work at Dartmouth College as a postdoctoral scholar. And I've spent about 15 years working in sub-Saharan Africa, which I'm currently trying to move from working in food systems in sub-Saharan Africa to working more in New England. So I'm launching a project working on social network analysis of regenerative agriculture throughout New England. My research essentially centralizes on how are we engaging with our global commons. And the global commons, or the commons in general, are shared resources that we manage collectively, that we maintain collectively by the community. So the talk that I'm going to go through today rests on two propositions. One, that our food systems can be managed as a commons, And two, that our financial systems can support ideas like regenerative agriculture that have a new vision for how we're going to feed our communities. And I want to explain this by talking about several different examples from around the world, one from Denmark, a few from Niger, where I've lived and worked for so long, and one from South Africa. So I'm taking you a little bit on a trip. So Frances Moore Lappé, during her talk, stated this quote here. I hope you can see it. So hope is not what we find in evidence, but what we become in action together. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the words within this quote that I think are really important to bring out when we're thinking about how to make this kind of financial transition, economic transition. And one is evidence. So we're facing a social and ecological crisis right now. And that's called climate change, along with COVID, and they're related to each other. So climate change, in the current way that we're dealing with it from a policy standpoint, really posits us as the proverbial frogs sitting in slowly boiling water. And we're not jumping out of that water because we're not necessarily seeing a drastic change that causes us to leave it. And we're sitting around kind of talking and trying to figure out what the best plans for becoming a sustainable society are, and ignoring some of the evidence that's showing that we're actually sitting in this boiling water and heck, we better get out of it. And some of the youth activists around the world, like Greta Thunberg, of course, have expressed how fed up and upset they are at adults for dragging their feet, essentially, and sitting in this boiling water and not doing anything about it that will produce a lasting type of change. The second word is action. And I like to think about this in relation to this idea of policymakers, but also the idea that we have policies that are really stuck within our corporatized economy. And in the past few weeks, for example, since George Floyd was killed, we've seen what kind of resistance we're capable of and what kind of direct action we're all capable of collectively. And I think this really rings true in this phrase that we're the ones that we've been waiting for, that we need to take action together collectively, and that we can do that. And the last word is this word together, and what that word really means in order to think about how we can come together and change our global commons and work together to shift the problems that we're facing in our global commons. So the COVID-19 crisis, this has really called upon us to recognize that we have this equalizing force. This crisis is like an equalizing force. So we're all really have become similarly affected by this crisis. And some of us have heard our neighbors say, some of us are meeting our neighbors for the first time, maybe because of being confined, but neighbors and policymakers and others have said, we're in this together. And this recognition of togetherness really transcends beyond the COVID situation to multiple crises, other types of crises, and their long-term solutions. And we have to be able to envision those together. We're in this boiling pot as frogs together. We're in the fight of the malignant structures that perpetuate racism, sexism, colonialism together. So we together, such as we are together in these situations, we have to shift that thinking, the thinking that creates these types of systems. So one of the examples that I wanted to bring up is a man named Yakuba Sawadogo, and he's known as the man who planted trees. So Frances Moore Lappé, in her opening for this conference, spoke about a need to shift consciousness from a scarcity mindset, and I'll add to that a fear-driven and a deprivation-driven mindset, to the EcoMind. And the EcoMind sees things in an ecological way. So what does that mean? It means that we're part of a series of interlinkages and connections within a system. We're not separate beings in that system that are competing against each other. We're not defined by our jobs and our positions and our purchasing power, but rather we're in a shared experience. And so my kindness reverberates to others. Your kindness to the earth reverberates around the world. And just like Yakuba Sawadogo, a peasant who came and planted trees throughout Burkina Faso, despite a lot of complaint from his neighbors that, what good are you going to do as one person? He was co-creating the world that he wanted to envision, he wanted to see. And so we also need to have that type of thinking that we can regenerate and protect and cherish the commons that we live in. So I want to share a brief story about my experiences in Niger. And this is a story about really the concept of cooperation around a commons and altruistic behavior. So this man, Yusuf Wadine, he was my research assistant when I was carrying out my doctoral research in Niger. And we often would sit around in the evenings and just talk about his life. And during one of such conversations, he mentioned his younger days living in Chintabaradan with his wife and family. And there was one day when he woke up in the morning, and he was a man who instead of following what his grandfather and father did for a living, which was pastoralism or animal husbandry, he decided to get an education. And when he woke up this one day, he realized he only had 5,000 sefa in his pocket, which is the equivalent of about $10. And his wife said to him, can you go to the market? I need a few things. So he carried on and went out to the market, and along the path to the market, he encountered his cousin. And his cousin shared a story with him about illness in his family. And Yusuf, without thinking, just reached his hand into his pocket, pulled out that 5,000 sefa bill and put it in the hand of his cousin, and then carried on his way to the market. And along the way, it just so happened that Yusuf encountered another friend. And through the course of their conversation, the friend realized that Yusuf was the right person to help him with a project that he had just started. And so he hired him, gave him an advance. Yusuf was able to go and make his purchases for his wife, and he went back home. Now, the important part about this story is the concept of how Yusuf was thinking about this issue. Yusuf didn't know if his cousin was going to be able to repay the amount of money that he gave him. He wasn't really acting in a way that was self-interested. He was basing his decisions more on the idea of that he lives in a society that had developed norms that were not just based on this idea of individualism and homo economicus, but on this idea of ecological thinking, this theory of interconnection that Frances Moore Lappé stated when she said, when we're locked in a scarcity mind, we remain blind to our own power. And we end up creating together a world that none of us as individuals would choose. And so I know you may be thinking you have nothing to do, no connection to this guy Yusuf who's in Niger, and your life is totally different than his, and the society is totally different, and we live in this dog-eat-dog world. But I wanted to just bring up also that biologists have observed and categorized, Jane Goodall, for example, ways in which animals acting boldly in altruistic and cooperative ways for their own survival. And we as humans are really the best and most experienced mammals at cooperation, but it demands a certain type of humility and a certain type of courage. So what are our financial models for food, for understanding food? How are they arranged? And what is the world that we're creating, or that we seek to create? So one of these financial models is one that incentivizes low-wage labor, punishes the protection of our global commons, and rewards systems that produce the inequalities that we're seeing. The Green Revolution was founded on the idea that we need to increase food production by focusing on specific commodities. In Niger, which is where this picture is from, that commodity was cotton. And so farmers shifted their subsistence food crops to cotton production, and prematurely were strapping themselves into this cash-based economy. Now, the post-World War II models for food production also set the scene for the current agribusiness system that we're in right now, that we've proved has been so fallible in light of this pandemic. Governments after World War II were experiencing food insecurity due to production losses. They also had all these new technologies that had come through wartime that they had to reintroduce into peacetime and repurpose to fit into the economy. So using this scarcity mindset, they set up the Green Revolution and made feed the world through technology the slogan of how we were going to move towards agribusiness, repurposing chemicals for agriculture. And during that time, over those years, 2/3 of Belgians' small farmers disappeared because they couldn't compete in these new conditions. Along with this came structural adjustment programming, which Niger experienced along with other developing countries. And this made it essential for governments to focus primarily on GDP growth as their main purpose. And they also collectively resulted in an increase in greenhouse gases, a decline in agrobiodiversity, a loss of soil carbon, soil is a carbon sink, et cetera, because of the damaging agronomic techniques that were being used. And in turn, eating habits shifted. So people were eating more and more processed foods, and that created more of a rise of obesity, especially in the developed world. And subsidies themselves became focused on only supporting agribusiness or large-scale farming. So the land holdings were linked directly to the subsidies. And those who had more land systematically were receiving more subsidies, more support. We saw that with the COVID support that's been distributed by our government. And this has systematically prevented new and first generation farmers from becoming a part of the farming system. It's discriminated based on race and gender and income throughout the world. And it's presupposed that a singular agronomic practice is what needs to be taken up by all farming systems, and it's pushed out agroecological farmers. So one realm of study that has tried to respond to these types of movements toward constant growth is a movement called Dgrowth. And Dgrowth essentially looks at, it's been developed by post-colonial thinkers like Vandana Shiva, like Arturo Escobar. And their ideas are that we need to understand how to create a system that's not just focused on growth. So degrowth, while it's not anti-growth, that's not the point. It is a response to the decades of colonialism and what Professor Joel Rogers of University of Wisconsin-Madison says, low road capitalism, which is an economic system that forces us into a society where we have no choice other than to act in destructive ways to our environment and to each other in order to survive. So degrowth scholar activists are defining and planning, how do we bring about this eco-mind, this ecological mind that Frankie speaks about? And regenerative farming is one such idea. However, it needs to be supported by policies such as a radical Green New Deal that's not focused merely on the growth of renewables, but also on social ecological responsibility. So how do we build this type of democratic food policy? How do we even imagine it? So I want to talk about a few different examples, but first I want to define this idea of a food as a commons. So again, as I said in the introduction, a commons is something shared that we all should have access to, and we all should agree on the rules of how this access is achieved. And in light of the COVID crisis, we've seen distribution of local food, especially to meet the needs of households that are suffering in an economic crisis. And this has bolstered the ability of low-income families to access food, buying them from local food suppliers and distributing them to canteens and drop-off centers that need the most help. So the same idea was put into place in Copenhagen with the Copenhagen Food System Center. And what the idea was behind this was there were a group of people who saw that elderly people who were living typically in centers, that they were often malnourished. And that malnourishment was coming from the food that they were eating, which was highly processed and that didn't have a lot of quality. And even the folks, the cooks that were making the food didn't desire to eat the food because of the low quality of this food. And so when they saw this problem, and when society sees problems and we decide to take control and find solutions together for those problems, you can make changes. And so here's what they did. They established public kitchens in Copenhagen, and they brought in about 40 million euros of food from local farmers. They negotiated with the public procurement office, and they asked for more of this organic produce to be brought into these elderly hostels. And the public procurement really wanted to focus on the lowest prices of food possible. They were still stuck in this price model. But this ignored, of course, the wider systemic issues in relation to health and food security and nutrition. So this group, the Food System Center, they decided that they should think about how to be more climate friendly, and they didn't lower the prices of the food or push suppliers to lower their prices, but they lowered the amount of meat and the amount of food waste, and they kept all the food organic. So they really studied the system of how the food was being produced. So the point's not to lower the price, but to look at the whole problem within the food system and not always look at ways to create more cheap food. The second example I want to bring up is from South Africa, and this is called the Zoomboo Catchment Partnership Program. And so this group came together as a volunteer network to focus on a river system that was experiencing lower levels of water, and the water was supplying cities. So they wanted to come up with ways to create more water infiltration throughout this catchment. And to do so, they wanted to also improve the livelihoods of people living in the area, which were a lot of poor farmers with small holdings, and also benefit the ecosystem services that were within that catchment. So together, the partnership came together. They decided to work on invasive species. So you see this picture in the upper right, and that's the infestation of a woody alien plant species called wattle. And so they started investing in teams of people to remove the wattle throughout the area. And through that removal, they were able to also restore some of the water, underground water sources. Another activity that was supported by a for-profit company called Meat Naturally was encouraging rangeland management systems that were doing rotational grazing. Now, this is similar to Alan Savory's model, but they're not practicing Savory's methods of holistic grazing. They're doing a hybrid version of that. And the idea is that those who are practicing holistic or more rotational grazing will be contributing to ecosystem services, and they'll receive premiums by Meat Naturally when they buy their meat at these mobile auctions that they've been hosting. Another way that they've been doing this is by creating a hub of information that's transparent. And so they've hired young people, typically through internships of folks who have finished their high school and they don't have anything to do. And so they've created internships for these youth to go out and learn about collecting data about the catchment. And so they've been collecting data across the catchment to understand if some of these different ecological inputs that they're putting into the catchment are having an impact. Okay, so I want to talk about two key problems within this whole system, and then I'll stop talking. So I think IPES has really brought together some of the key kind of lock-ins of our locked-in system of food that we need to focus on dismantling. And this understanding that we're really working within these causal pathways where we have to focus on cheap food, we have to have this narrative that in order to feed the world, we have to do it one singular way. And all of this system that's locked in creates these path dependencies that fail when you have situations of crisis versus a local organized system where the food is produced and supplied. And the other thing about this is that cities often don't have control over their own food security because of this path dependency and this locked in nature of the market. And so they're really beholden to the trade commodity markets in order to supply grocery stores and whatnot. So the system really needs to shift so that we have stronger food security throughout. And I'm going to stop there and pass the microphone. Who's the next speaker? Is it?
I'm up.
Oh, Jesse. Okay, great. So,
Julie, that was awesome. Thank you so much. That was awesome. And I think it's very important to get the global perspective that you just gave us all, and so that we all understand that this is not a local issue only, that this is happening around the world, and it stems from, like you said, Julie, a scarcity mindset. And so I appreciate that. Leads in perfectly to where I'm going. So huzzah. My name's Jesse McDougall. I am co-owner at Studio Hill. We are a regenerative farm over in Shaftesbury, Vermont, the southwest corner. We have been using holistic management since 2012 to regenerate the natural resources in our land and natural cycles in our land after 40 plus years of conventional farming, where we lost feet of topsoil on our wet rolling hills and family members to cancer and so on and so forth. So that was our crisis moment when we made the shift. And since then, we have been able to regenerate 100 plus acres of pasture on our 270 acre farm back to abundance, natural abundance, and incredible biodiversity. And it's been the thrill of a lifetime to watch all that come back. And in 2019, we were offered a spot in the Savory Institute's Influencer Hub program. So we're now one of 50 hubs around the world in their network that is a showcase for what regenerative agriculture can do in the ecosystem. I'm also co-founder of the Regenerative Food Network, which is a farmer investment and infrastructure company that's working throughout the region, throughout upstate New York. Well, I should say all New York, because we'll be down in the city too, but New York and New England, to finance the regional food system, identify gaps where things have been removed over years of dismantling and moving to the more efficient landscapes like the Midwest, and reinvesting in small farms and farmers and building essentially the transition bridge that can help farmers get out of the trap that Julie was talking about, and into a more into a regenerative model where it is a transition essentially from negative feedback loops to positive feedback loops, right? So farmers right now are stuck. Many farmers are stuck, and they know they're not the villains, first of all. Got to make that clear. Their farmers are stuck in the degenerative economic model, right? So many farmers are stuck with debt-heavy operations, huge infrastructure, and they've inherited it from previous generations or previous owners. And because food margins are so slim, they don't have the economic luxury of experimentation. They have to get their product to market every year on a schedule, or bad things start happening. Bills don't get paid, taxes don't get paid, farms start getting lost. And in fact, we're losing 1,000 farms a year across that region, New York and New England, every year, because it is getting harder and harder to farm in this area due to lack of infrastructure, supporting infrastructure, and a more and more expensive model of farming, because every time you spray your field with chemicals and fertilizers, the next year it is a little bit less able to produce on its own. So you need to add more fertilizers and chemicals to control the environment. And that is a reductionist approach. That is an industrial approach. And after about 40 years in this climate, it runs out of steam. And that's what we're running into now. And the problem is, operating on a knife's edge the way that we are in the farming world, even though we may have all the motivation to change from conventional to organic regenerative models, we may have the will, we may have the time, we may have the tools, we don't have the economic ability, right? You can't, because as soon as you stop spraying your fields and get out of that system, there's a collapse. Your fields, it takes time for your fields to recover biologically to start producing on their own again, right? A number of years in this area. We were able to break that cycle because we were in 2012 new to farming, didn't know what we were doing, and we're going to mess up anyway. So we just messed up hard and figured out a way forward. We were lucky enough to have something else supporting the farm, and that was a horse boarding facility, a small one. It didn't. We call it the locals horse boarding farm. That's gone now, but that gave us cover to make the transition. And most farms of any size don't have something big enough there to make that transition. So that's where it is our hope that the Regenerative Food Network can help farmers make that transition through financing, through bridge loans, and by making it more profitable to farm in the area by rebuilding the USDA meat and poultry plants. We're building an organic tannery well, I'll give you the rough overview. We're trying to build across New York and New England 20 rural food centers, right? So aggregation points for farmers where they can bring their food locally for processing, packaging, distribution from that point, so that they don't have to travel to, like, for example, I have to go to Rhode Island to get chickens processed legally to sell a chicken breast to my neighbor who I could hit his house with a rock, if I threw it, which is rare in Vermont. But anyway, so through infrastructure and through loans and through financing, we're hoping to make it possible for farmers to make this transition. So once all the food comes into these rural aggregation points and gets processed, we're bringing the food down to New York, Boston, up to Montreal, to Albany, to the urban points in the region on our electric truck fleet, and the first trucks are arriving this summer, and selling the food there to chefs and to direct-to-consumer. The hope being that we can bring high-quality, regionally produced food down to the cities and sell them to the highest value markets that we have in our area, so that when we bring the money home, it is, when we hand a check to the farmer, it's as heavy as possible as it can be, so that they can sustain their life on the land. Land can be profitable and not vulnerable to being gobbled up by housing developers and second homeowners. And we can create good jobs back on the land in this area. Obviously, the COVID-19 crisis has made very clear the weak points in our industrial continental food system, I'll call it. It's my hope that by building more and smaller facilities, we alleviate those bottlenecks, where if one plant shuts down for any reason, the other 19 food centers can make up the difference, compensate for the loss. So that's our goal, and our goal is a long goal. We're playing the long game here, so we're going for 2030. We want it to be a 10-year transition where we get all these things up and running. We've already raised our first round of funding, so we're solvent and operating for the next year. We've already been at this for a year and a half. We're looking for the second round of funding now, and we've got some great leads. And our first USDA meat plant comes online in July. The tannery that's attached to it comes online soon after, and the trucks are arriving. So things are starting to move. And if anybody's interested in farmer starter packs or starter kits where we help you fund the startup of a farm, call me. If you're looking to get your products to the city, call me. We're working on ways to do all these things. So thank you for that. It's an honor to be here. I will pass to Nic.
Well, thank you, Jesse. I like you that it's an honor to be here, and I'm glad I was invited to speak on this panel about all the good things we got going on. So my name is Nic Cook. I work at Cedar Circle Farm in East Thetford, Vermont. We're in the Connecticut River Valley, and we are certified organic farm, diversified mixed vegetables. We have a small orchard, and we also grow about 6 acres of strawberries, and we have about approximately 1.5 acres of blueberries as well. So we have a pretty diverse vegetable and berry operation. We sell primarily out of our farm stand, located right on the side of the road. We also have a extensive educational programming that we we host a lot of educational programs on the farm as well. A lot geared towards regenerative agriculture, especially in the last 2 years. So we farm about I'd say 45 acres total. That does include some cover cropping, but at least a third, 30 acres of that is in active production. So I'm kind of bringing a little bit of the vegetable producer aspect to this conversation to echo a lot of what Jesse's already talked about, those price margins are narrow for vegetable guys and all farmers in the state of Vermont, organic or conventional. We're always looking at that. And so got to back up a little bit. So we are actively in the process of transitioning our production fields here at Cedar Circle Farm to more regenerative systems of agriculture, primarily focused on moving towards more no-till systems. And that has sort of, for me personally, it's had quite a dramatic effect because, when I started out farming here, about 17 years ago, my specialty was tillage and irrigation as well, so I became pretty proficient at both of those aspects of vegetable farming. And, right before we started beginning the transition here, it was, the summers were getting hotter. It was getting drier. I was spending a lot of time on a tractor in a dust bowl, and or spending a lot of time, irrigating crops. We have a really fine, silty, sandy soil here, which is a blessing during a rainy time, but it dries out. When it dries out, it's dry, and it takes a lot of moisture to maintain vegetable production in some well-drained soils. There was when I started doing more researching and discovering about there's different ways to farm that you can avoid these things. So that's really what's helped transform, along with all the other things that both Julie and Jesse have mentioned on it in the agricultural world and communities. We're very community focused here as well. So, and of course, coming from an organic background, we tend to have a pretty good figure on the pulse of what our community is looking for when they come to a farm as well. So these are all environmental concerns, and being right in the, looking right at the Connecticut River, we have those environmental concerns through degenerative farming practices, so to speak, that even exist in the organic world too. So it's a slow process as far as the transition goes. There's many challenges, but we're learning new things every year. And to also echo what so Jesse sort of mentioned, that we made plenty of mistakes. We are trying to still manage a successful production farm at the same time that we're transitioning. So we're sort of we're specializing, and we're sort of running experiments on a small scale, so we can sort of balance the two. But it is by far very challenging to sort of if you were to come at this brand new to get any kind of funding, because it's not gonna, the money's not necessarily going to be there right away. It takes time, like Jesse mentioned too. You got to build up the biology. You got to regrow that soil that you've been degrading over the years through whatever practices, the tillage and whatnot. So it's definitely going to take a while before we see the results, but I do believe that it's possible, and that it's also necessary at this point. I have a 2-year-old son, so I think about what he's gonna, what type of a world is he gonna be growing up in. So, sort of going back to where Julie was with the whole world concept of how powerful agriculture can be in mitigating climate change. I think that's can definitely play a role. So, yeah, that's kind of where we are. Just slowly transitioning, bringing the vegetables into the regenerative world. So that's all I got for now. So I'll go ahead and pass the mic to Nico.
Sure. Now, Nick, before I pass, there were 2 specific questions that came up that you might be, it might be good for you to answer right away, which are, have the initiatives at Cedar Circle Farm been getting or receiving support from the Vermont Department of Agriculture at all? And the second question is, are you going to look for certification with ROC when it's offered publicly?
I believe so, yes. And we have been having conversations with ROC about their regenerative certification and some of the challenges that are there. But probably yes. I would think so. It's actually interesting around the certification world, and I'd like to hear about how the savory guys view vegetable production as well, because it's I just look at all of that information as relevant and to see how that could all come together and work. And but from the Agency of Agriculture of Vermont specifically, we typically do have a really good relationship with the UVM and the Extension Service. And so yeah, it's and I've also been fortunate enough to have been able to participate in some of the payment for ecosystem services conversations that have been happening around agriculture, which I think regenerative agriculture is going to have a role to play in that in the future. So conversations are being had, and but are they paying attention to us specifically? I'm not really sure as far, but.
Thank you. So hello everyone, my name is Nico Lustig. I'm an attorney with Dunkiel Saunders, which is a mission-based, mission-focused law firm up in Burlington, Vermont. I am licensed to provide legal services to Vermont, in Vermont, and it's an honor to be a part of this program and a part of this panel. And I just feel really quite grateful to be among such wonderful agricultural producers and thinkers on how to create a better world and a new system. With the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been a lot of talk about returning to normal, and I feel very strongly that, as probably many people on the call today, that returning to normal isn't going to work for anyone in our society or our environment or economic ecological systems. And so using agriculture and financing of farming mechanisms to kind of create the new normal is really something I'm quite interested in. I have my JD and Masters of Food and Agriculture Law and Policy from Vermont Law School. I also studied business and food systems at UMass Amherst. I have over 20 plus years of experience working with organic farmers and with food cooperatives in particular. I also had quite a few years, I worked as a food business development specialist at the Franklin County Community Development Corporation out of Greenfield, Massachusetts, which is the home to the Western Mass Food Processing Center. So my roots are quite deep with food and agriculture, in so much as I'm also a trustee for the organization Red Tomato, which was founded by some of the co-creators of Equal Exchange, which works to promote domestic fair trade programs in food distribution and promotion, and actually does eco certification of foods, which is used to promote integrated pest management and other growing practices that support or New England farmers and farmers from who are doing things using fair trade and cooperative type principles to maintain agriculture and growing lands in the New England area as well as other places in the country. Not only looking at the ecological, but also the human perspective of their farming. Let's see, I am also a fellow with the Sustainable Economies Law Center, which is an organization out of California that works nationally to support transitional or transactional attorneys who are working on regenerative systems, including financial and cooperative models that really look at this much bigger global perspective on how to create a more community-based and sustainable-based system using our laws and using contracts and real estate and business entity formation. Through that, in my legal practice now, I do a lot of work with farmers here in Vermont and with farm and food businesses, supporting their transactional needs, such as land leases, contracts, support with intellectual property protection or enforcement when other people are utilizing intellectual property that doesn't belong to them, support with marketing and advertising, so helping farmers who are going to make particular claims on their products or about their farming practices be able to do so without misleading or fraudulently representing what they're doing. And then we also help with employment law and financing concerns that may come up. And many of the organizations and groups that I work with through my legal practice are cooperatives or are transitioning into a cooperatively owned model. And I just feel very grateful that throughout my entire life, I've had the opportunity to work with and work in support of very innovative, creative risk takers and to help them minimize the risk so that they can move forward with their creative and innovative ideas to build that new society. I'm here today on this panel to really think about what these agricultural systems look like, and I will address some very specific financial models that are being used to address some of the questions that were raised earlier about what systems could be used here in New England and then also throughout the other parts of this country and other parts of this world. But I want to take like a very brief kind of revisit to this historical legal perspective to just mention that for a really long time, the agricultural system and kind of the laws and regulations that are set up around that are designed specifically kind of under this ongoing myth that these large scale agribusiness is like the way to feed the world. And as we can tell from all the stories that we've heard today from different agricultural practices and even from the experiences of our panelists on their farms, is that these systems degenerate the soil and make it harder and more intensive to continue growing. And so really looking at what those new ways of feeding the world is quite important. And we've seen that trend grow in things like the natural foods market and in the organics market, which has gone from a very niche, tiny kind of like outcast sort of system of eating to an exploded billion-dollar industry where large companies have really dominated in the retail and marketing component for organic foods and organic brands. And I bring that up because organic is a system like regenerative agriculture that started with farmers, that came out of community-based ideas on how to grow food and what standards to set. And when it became law, it became adopted by much larger kind of groups in the agricultural facilities or in the agricultural industry that were able to kind of take that brand and do some really major sales and marketing with it, to the point where Walmart has the largest market share for organic foods these days, where the cooperatives and natural food cooperatives that were kind of the outposts for where to purchase locally grown and organically grown foods have just been able to maintain a very small percentage of that market share. I bring this up because I think it's really important from a legal perspective to note that in our federal system, we do have laws against large-scale mergers that consolidate certain systems, but in our food systems in particular, those laws haven't seemed to be enforced. And so right now in the Judiciary Committee of Congress, there is the Merger Moratorium Antitrust Act that, if this goes to Congress and passes, would issue a moratorium on large food, beverage, and agribusiness and grocery retail mergers. And it would create a commission that would examine mergers and their impact on the market power of these large agro businesses and the food and beverage industry in general. And so I, as like a point of interest, I just encourage you to take a look at that. And if you feel so moved, to contact your elected representatives to ask them to kind of move that forward. And the reason why is that recently there was a merger or an acquisition where Bayer purchased Monsanto, which created an $66 billion deal, creating the world's largest supplier of seeds and farm chemicals. So for many places around the world, these are the areas where people are getting access to seeds. And right now, the largest percentage of that market share globally is within one company. In this country right now, the top 4 pork producers have 71% of the market share. The top 4 beef packers have 81% of the market share, and the top 4 corn sellers have 85% of the market share. And what we've seen with COVID and this global pandemic is that there have been many instances where, if there's an outbreak in one of these facilities, that the whole system shuts down and we're not able to get food into the shelves. So these are really arguments in support of growing a much stronger, localized, regenerative food system so that we can keep feeding people healthy food and redistribute some of that back to the land and back to our local communities. So what we're talking about with regenerative agriculture and these regenerative economic systems, oh, thanks Julie for sharing that information. I will say that it's really important and for us to look at these systemic systems, but also to create them using just and sound policies that promote sustainable economies and sustainable communities in them in a way that they don't or can't be overtaken. So coming up with uniform definitions in our legislature and working from a policy perspective to kind of define what regenerative agriculture means and what these cost for carbon systems actually look like. And there are many different systems that are happening throughout the country that could utilize this type of uniformity in their definitions and creating those systems from these localized up. So that would be identifying what food sovereignty is and defining that, identifying what degrowth is and identifying that. And so I just encourage you to today or soon to take some action on reaching out and to the farmers that are here and coming up with what those definitions are and bringing those proposals to the legislatures that you're working with. In terms of the financial and financing systems for the particular types of agriculture that Nick and Jesse are doing, and for the types of growing projects that Julie has seen in other countries, one of the things that's very common amongst them all is that there is not an easy way to access funds for this type of system. In particular, a lot of the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, and even some state agriculture programs are designed to fund the agribusinesses just by nature of the way that the laws are currently written. And so in order to build a more resilient system, it's on the onus of the financiers and kind of community support organizations to really revisit what their funding criteria are so that they can include these regenerative agriculture systems in place. And so one of the examples, many examples in New England where this is happening is right now there's a group that's called the Blueprint, which is a group of regional business assistance. It's a regional business assistance alliance for farms and food businesses that is working together with technical support assistance and with community-based funders to be able to provide technical assistance and financing for these alternative and regenerative agricultural systems. One which I had worked with before becoming a lawyer is the PB Grows Investment Fund. And I don't know, when we get to Q&A, I would be really interested to see if anyone who's attending this panel today has heard of this program and has gotten involved with any of them. From a kind of broad, like large scale view, the PB Grows Investment Fund has worked with community members to collect investments from people who live in the New England region, predominantly the Pioneer Valley in Western Massachusetts, but that extends into Vermont and some in New York as well, to be able to make even small scale investments of $1,000 to $10,000 into their community, and those funds get recirculated back into the community itself to be able to fund agricultural producers and agricultural endeavors that may not be able to access funds from traditional financing systems. And one of the components where like a legal perspective comes in and legal support is useful is that in many cases when you're asking community members to make those types of investments, there are securities regulation laws that could be triggered. So for farmers or even financing systems that are looking into doing this type of community-based investment or seeking funds from communities to grow these systems, it's really essential to be able to work with attorneys that know about securities regulations so that they can help you kind of avoid the risk of breaking some of the laws inadvertently. That's my dog who's agreeing. Before we jump into questions, I just wanted to say that another thing I encourage any of the kind of financiers or technical assistance people who are on this call today is to really look at how those funds are being distributed from an equitable and racial perspective. Right now, less than 0.4% of the farms in the US are Black owned. And in light of the kind of current situation of our country, and we'll just say very strongly that Slow Living Summit has put out a statement, and all of the panelists here agree to Black Lives Matter. It's really important, and we have put together a list of programs. Julie's going to share the presentation slide of farm organizations and groups that support people of color who are in agriculture. And we'd like to take a moment to have like a moment of silence, and also for you to look through this list and identify some ways that you can support these organizations as they work to really grow these regenerative agriculture systems by bringing in people of color. And I'll just put one quick shout out that Karen Washington, who is one of the Slow Living Summit presenters on Thursday, she'll be doing a virtual tour of her garden. She is the co-founder of the Black Urban Growers Project as well. So you can learn more about that on the Thursday panel. And we'll start our moment of silence, and feel free to type your questions in.
Nico, just before we do that, do we want to have Jesse talk a little bit about the opportunity?
Yes, Jesse, it's on you. Exciting news.
Are we talking about the fellowship?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, on the list here, we set up a Regenerative Food Network Farmers of Color Fellowship, and we're now accepting applications for 5 fellows. Fellows will receive a scholarship for training in holistic management at Stonewall Farm in Keene under the Savory Institute program, and land placement and land lease costs for 2 years, plus all the additional startup assistance that Regenerative Food Network already offers. So we can help people get up and running. If you're interested, email me at that email address.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate taking the time for the thoughtful reflection. And we're all happy to speak with you and answer questions that you might have about the work that we're doing and how that can be translated into what you came here for today.
I also just want to say thank you for speaking today. Everyone was wonderful. We learned quite a bit, and I think this is just the beginning to the conversation. So super excited to open this up for questions. And I did want to follow up on one from earlier as well, from Laura, asking about, are these initiatives getting support from the Vermont Department of Ag? We do have David Zuckerman on the next panel. So if you have questions about state-related things, that might be a good place as well to jump on in. So just giving that little plug, but also that we do have resources we can maybe also speak to what the Department of Ag is doing for different initiatives around either regenerative or other farming practices. And I can also ask this question if you, folks would like. So we have Daniel Hershaw asking for Jesse, will you talk in more detail about your electric truck fleet, as in makes, cost, range, full electric, hybrid, etc.? Thanks.
Absolutely. So the idea here with the electric truck fleet is to get carbon sequestering, ecosystem restoring food out of the rural areas and to the cities in carbon neutral vehicles, so that we can actually get people in the city who want to jump into the climate fight, a way to do that when they can't go out and plant trees or manage or they're an organic farm, that kind of thing. So they will be, the first ones that are arriving are fully electric. We are buying some internal combustion trucks that we just need to get moving, and then we'll convert them over. We're converting, I think, 3 as well over to fully electric. That's happening soon. The goal is to be fully 100% electric by 2030. And to do that, we're building solar charging stations at all the rural hubs, solar charging stations at all the urban hubs, and cafes throughout the system, little charging cafes that will be akin to gas stations where people can, from the public, can come charge their cars. We can recharge our fleet, but you can come in, get, tacos and food from the network and wait that 45 minutes that it takes for your batteries to fill up, learn about regenerative agriculture, learn about farm stays and experiences in the area, so that, again, trying to get money out of the urban areas and back into the rural communities in any way we can, whilst promoting regenerative ag. Plus, because the panels on the food centers and the cafes will not be nearly enough to cover the use of the whole system, we are deploying a lot of solar on farms, whether that's rooftops, barns, or whatnot. And if we're getting into regenerative solar grazing, if you're interested in regenerative solar grazing in fields where we're not replacing prime ag land, but amplifying it by creating a panel system that's high enough to graze under regeneratively and holistically, so you get power and regeneration going out of the same acreage, so that the whole network will be 100% renewable energy powered by 2030 as well.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. I also just wanted to follow up on my own question as well. I know that during our personal talks that we've had before the conference, something that you mentioned, Jesse, is one of the challenges to the regenerative movement is that there are lots of people doing it, but not necessarily cohesion. And I wanted to know if you could speak to that a little bit more.
Well, the term regenerative is big and ill-defined. And, when I use it, I'm speaking about ecological ecosystem regeneration, regenerating the natural resources in the land, like the soil, the biodiversity, the plants, water cycles, and all that kind of stuff. So that's pretty cut and dry. When you speak about it in terms of society or in terms of an economy, that's when it starts to get pretty fuzzy. And so what I mean by it is, in those instances is, are things getting stronger, more able to sustain themselves? Are livelihoods are people more able to sustain themselves in their lives independently? You know what I mean? It's a food sovereignty. It's a regional sovereignty issue for me. Can we build a society that is equitable, that is, I view this as the next step in human evolution. Any species that's still around today on the planet has evolved to a point where by expressing its natural behaviors, it makes the environment around it more able to sustain it, right? So everywhere the sheep go on my land, because they're acting naturally, the grass comes back stronger, thicker, lusher, etc. Humans haven't gotten there yet. This regenerative movement could be that, if it becomes like second nature to us, where everywhere we go, things get stronger, more abundant, and more able to sustain us and the life around us and the ecosystems around us. So a shift from extractive to regenerative mindset.
Also want to open that up to anyone else if they had any thoughts. Okay, then we can move on to the next question. And this is, again, open for anyone who wants to answer this. Have any other countries or states established a legal definition / standard for regenerative?
So I'll take a first stab at that by just saying, not that I'm aware of, but there have been, in Vermont in particular, discussions about what regenerative agriculture could look like. And there's been a lot more talk about what ecosystem services would look like. So that might be kind of getting towards the first step of answering that question. Globally, Julie, have you seen anything that could respond to that?
Yeah, so one of the slides that I didn't show you guys is this one, and this might be a little bit difficult to see, but it was put together by a man named Ethan Soloviv, and he just wanted to understand who's who in this regenerative movement. And I guess as a scholar, I call it a movement for now. And I think that was also the case for organic agriculture before it became standardized. And what differentiates between a movement versus a standard is that once something is standardized, a box is drawn around it. And if you're moving outside of that box, you're suddenly something that's a deviant within the system. So I think the wonderful thing, the great thing about regenerative ag right now is this resistance to standardization, which allows us to develop our ideas as far as how are we rebuilding ecological systems. In South Africa, the government has started to use a term called ecological infrastructure in a lot of their documents on how they're rebuilding biodiversity. In France, after the Paris Agreement, after the conference that promoted or produced the Paris Agreement in 2016, I believe, there was an initiative called 4 per 1,000, and that number basically means the amount of soil around the globe that we need to regenerate in order to stop climate change as a problem. So it's looking at sequestration of greenhouse gases through our natural systems. And so 0.04% of land is all that needs to really shift, which is hopeful, I would say, going back to this concept of hope. And this is a list, again, of the industry, of folks who are thinking about regeneration, about regenerative ag. And this is not an all-inclusive list. I think Ethan put this together last year, and there's still development around this project. But another graphic that he has on his website, if you take a look at it, is just a bar graph that shows exponential increases in the amount of industries, nonprofit organization, farmers using this term regenerative. So we can see it as a part of this economic future. And Jesse, I think, spoke to that a lot too. But again, I would, as a social ecologist, I would say I'm really hesitant to say, let's define it so quickly, because transformation itself comes about in chaos. It comes about in anarchy, in fact, not within systems that are so stalwart that people can't bring in new ideas. And so the more we allow this idea to regenerate, I think the better off it will be, the better it will look. But I think Nico is probably going to say to me, no, we need standardization because it protects farmers. So I think there's two sides to the coin.
Can I jump in with a question here? Nick and Jesse, it sounds like when you started your operations, there was a bit of trial and error. Is there any kind of formal training or learning opportunities for people that want to get into regenerative farming so they don't keep repeating the same trial and error mistakes over and over?
Nick, you want to take that first? You're muted, I think.
Thank you, Jesse. So currently we don't have any sort of formal training set up, but we do offer or will be offering sort of we call workshops where people can come and learn about a lot of the mistakes that we've made. So if they were thinking about how to transition some of their vegetable production, for example, if you were a farmer and you were thinking about transitioning some of your vegetable production, you could certainly come and chat with us about what not to do. Some things that we figured out exactly what you should avoid doing, and where we're at. And I'm also my email is on our website, and I answer any questions that people have about the processes that we are going through and stuff. As we transition, again, it's just kind of a slow process, and we are just trying to move forward. A lot of challenges still. So, but yeah.
So when we started, let me just phrase it this way. I'd much rather be starting today than 8 years ago. We are farther along on that exponential growth curve that was just mentioned. And there are a lot more practitioners, resources, and people out there who can help new farmers getting started today. I put a link in the chat to the Savory Global Network. Each of those hubs in that map is a training center for the Savory Network if you're interested in holistic management. And this is it's born out of livestock management, but it's not exclusive to livestock management. The Savory training is about ecological outcomes and how do you produce that within your context and your climate and your specific point on earth, whether that's a Vermont hillside or a Vermont valley floor or Zimbabwe or Arizona. Everything is different. Regeneration, the tools and practices you need to regenerate a specific piece of land will vary depending on that specific piece of land. So it's not a tools and practice based training. It is a decision making training. So that's out there, and I encourage everybody to check that out, because independent of what you're growing or how you want to grow it or whatever, it will help you become a better land manager and farmer. If you want to get into learning the tools and practices part of farming, then I don't know of any specific organizations out there that are doing it on a big scale. I'd reach out to Rodale. They're a fantastic organization, and they may have a list for you. Other than that, I would reach out to your local farmers that you know and respect, and if they can't help you directly, they may know people who can. So, and feel free to email me. And if you're interested in any kind of specific type of regenerative ag, I can try to point you in the right direction for mentors.
And I'll just add to that. I'm launching a project at Dartmouth, which will incorporate some students who are doing some research on an actor database of all of the farmers in New Hampshire and Vermont that are using the term regenerative ag as part of their profiles. And we'll be geolocating all of those farms and then making an open access database or website, I guess, of that information. So that I hope to contribute to this discussion and provide that as a service. And hopefully eventually we'll also kind of follow up by networking kind of ecological outcomes with those regenerative farmers and looking at how they're impacting the watershed as well, similar to the project I spoke about in South Africa and the network that they've created around watershed management.
Thanks for offering all those resources. It's really great to have that, some action. We also have another question from Douglas Cook. What about NOFA chapters?
Douglas, can you explain that a little bit more deeply?
Sorry, we can bring Douglas up as well, so we can ask it himself. So I'm going to try to do that and see if he can clarify a little.
Hi, yeah, thanks for taking me and taking my question. I appreciate all of your perspectives. I have been participating in NOFA chapter events for a long time, and it seems like they're really starting to go more into regenerative style agricultures. For example, NOFA New Hampshire, invited Steve Gabriel out for their keynote speaker and was really inspiring their intensive series. And, folks like John Kemp and that sort of thing. I feel like they're a great resource.
Well, I can just say that I'm definitely using NOFA's database as part of the research that I'm doing from that perspective. I agree, they're an excellent resource.
We have a lot of NOFA folks who signed up for this event, so there's a lot of representation here. So
Yeah.
awesome. So I'm glad you said that, Julie.
I think we might all agree that NOFA has been a wonderful resource for so many of the farmers in our region. And I know I mentioned a lot about how the definition of organic had been kind of co-opted by some of the larger players in the food industry. But I do say that the NOFA chapters and throughout New England have really done a wonderful job of maintaining what those standards are and kind of advocating for having standards that promote like practices that are happening on local and regional farms, as well as protecting consumers from the misuse of these terms.
And we should note that, what we mean by regenerative today is what organic meant on day one when it was founded, as a response to the Dust Bowl to get carbon down in the soil. And as that organic definition drifted away with the rise of chemical farming, regenerative kind of swooped in and filled that vacuum. But I think with a bigger mission of under the view of climate change and with a well, yeah.
Thanks everyone for answering that. I think we have time for one more here. This is from Laura. Do any of you have resources for ecosystem services, payment models, and/or case studies?
Yeah, I've read tons of scientific articles about payments for ecosystem services. I also am somewhat of a political ecologist, so I know that there's a lot of inequities involved with payments for ecosystem services that one needs to be aware of, and so very often the same things that have happened with subsidy programs in this country supporting the strongest and the most powerful actors, I think, have happened under PES also schemes. But I'd be happy to share those. You can find I think my email address on the Dartmouth site. You can search for my name and you'll find my email address. So please contact me and I'm happy to share papers with you about that.
There may also be some resources on Vermont's Agency of Ag website too, on their recent work on payment for ecosystem services. I know there's a lot of webinars that were given that talked about those things specifically. I think it's under the subheading of under the water quality initiatives, and you can find it under payment for ecosystem services there in the drop down window, and it lists, you kind of have to hunt around a little bit for it, but they do have some stuff that's publicly available for people to look at on their website.
And I'll just add this, it's not strictly payments for ecosystem services, but there's a lot of investment money now opening up for based on carbon futures, right?
Mm.
So if you want to look at something cool, Regen Future Capital is an organization out of London and Colorado, and they have a few more offices around the world. They are looking to fund the regeneration of land, and the way they're doing that is they're talking to landowners and specifically of degraded landscapes and using the what's it called? Oh, I don't know, the various carbon sequestering models that are out there estimating how much carbon could be sequestered in that chunk of land if it were transitioned from practice A to practice B. And then they give that farmer a chunk of money, up to, you know, tens of thousands of dollars based on basically enough transition money to make the move. And then they, in exchange for the carbon credits that they'll resell in the market later. So it's a way that they have found to monetize carbon sequestration in soil, and the money goes to the farmer making the transition, and they make a little money off of selling them later. So it's a great economic bridge system, and the Regenerative Food Network is looking at developing a similar system based on the EOV program. So it's not just a carbon market system where you are measuring the contents of an ecosystem, but I think more holistically measuring the function of the ecosystem across the board. So we're working with the Savory Network to develop that as well.
Great. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you all. We are out of time, but I did want to just say that we are having a happy hour on Thursday night. And we did one last week, and it was a great way for our attendees to continue some of these conversations. There's a lot to unpack in all of the stuff that you've all presented today. And I think, you know, continuing those conversations are really key. So it's Thursday night at 5 o'clock is our happy hour, and there's links to that in the registration packets that you all received. And if any of our panelists are free and can attend, that would be fantastic. I know I myself, my head is like spinning right now. So much information. I have so many questions. But thank you all for being here. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Nico. Thank you, Julie. Thank you to our sponsors, Breakthrough Beverage and Meadows Beef Farm. We do have our agriculture policy in times of uncertainty panel coming up at 3 o'clock. And we hope you all can join us for that. And have a great day. Thank you all so much.
Thank you all as well.
Thanks everyone for attending too. It's great to see your questions and be part of this.
See you soon.